Carlos, you have recently released a book entitled The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. And I'm glad that you're publishing this book right about now, Carlos, because it's pretty clear, I think, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, that the world is in a tumultuous period right now for a number of reasons. But one of the core reasons is the fact that U.S. imperialism is in crisis, is in decline, and is very aware of that crisis and decline and what lie at the root of that crisis for the U.S. empire is the rise of China that threatens U.S. unipolar hegemony. But China's rise has been distinctly different from the rise of the U.S., as we've discussed with you and others on the show when talking about China. And indeed, the socialist project within China is what's motivating and stimulating so much of what we're seeing, I think, in the geopolitical arena. And so just to begin, Carlos, I want to ask just a very fundamental question. Why did you publish this book about Chinese socialism in this moment? What were your motivations, and why do you think it's important that we understand Chinese socialism right about now?
Sure. Well, I mean, the primary reason for writing the book is, you kind of said it, but China is just an extremely important issue, and it's one that's very widely misunderstood. And that's not only among the general population in the West that it's understood, but also, I would say, including within the left, within, socialist, progressive, communist, anti-imperialist, anti-war movements. And that lack of understanding is really harmful. Among the general population, it's very harmful because, the imperialist ruling classes are building a case to wage war against China. We've seen China emerge as the number one enemy in the narrative, right? This new Cold War propaganda onslaught really, it differs very little from the original Cold War propaganda onslaught against the Soviet Union, against the other socialist countries. As it stands, everything China does is bad. Every problem in the world is blamed on China. All sorts of slanders are hurled. China's engaged in genocide. China's luring countries in Africa and Latin America and the Middle East into a debt trap. China's a deeply authoritarian state with no democratic structures and so on. And then kind of parallel with that, nothing positive is ever said about China, right? China lifted literally hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's the most extensive poverty alleviation campaign effort in history, but apparently it doesn't warrant a mention. China's emerged as a global leader in renewable energy and biodiversity, but that doesn't warrant a mention. China's response to COVID has meant that, thankfully, up to probably 5 million Chinese people are still alive that wouldn't still be alive if China had followed the type of strategy that we've followed in Britain or that you followed in the US in relation to managing COVID. But actually, China's COVID response is only maligned and criticized in the Western press. So people have this completely distorted view of China. So many people think of it as a bad actor, as an aggressive force, a reactionary force, a threat to peace, a threat to stability. And that makes those people just completely open to anti-China propaganda, to the new Cold War, to this escalating project of containment and encirclement, and ultimately to the idea of war against China. We're in a situation where you've got very influential sections of the ruling class that are literally gearing up for war against China, and they're trying to use Taiwan as their flashpoint. They've decided that the only way that the US can maintain its dominance, its geopolitical dominance, its economic dominance, is if they can force China into a war. They can weaken its economy, they can weaken its popularity, they can destabilize the country. And so the people of the US, of Britain, of Western Europe, of Canada, of Australia may well find themselves facing this question. Do we accept war against China? Do we agree that China shouldn't be allowed to rise? Do we agree that protecting US hegemony is more important than building sensible cooperation around climate change, around pandemics, around nuclear weapons and poverty and so on? And, if people's consent has been manufactured, they're not going to take a stand against war. They're not going to take a stand against this incredibly reckless behavior. So that's one very important aspect of why I wanted to try and improve people's understanding of China. It's a contribution to an anti-war project, a project for peace and for multipolarity. And another aspect which you touched on, and which is more directly related to the left, to Marxists, to socialists, is about understanding China's socialism. I don't make any bones about it. I'm a Marxist, I'm a Leninist. I aim to support socialist projects and to make whatever little contribution that I can to the global movement for socialism. And on that basis, it seems to me that it's extremely important to understand and to analyze China. So many people say, well, since the introduction of market reforms in the late 70s, China's become a capitalist country now. But then if we accept that, how do we then explain the advances that have been made by Chinese people, including ordinary people? How do we explain the lifting of 800 million people out of poverty? How do we explain this journey, this trajectory from being one of the world's poorest countries with a life expectancy of 35 to being, a leading innovator in renewable energy and artificial intelligence and so on, with a life expectancy of 78, which, that's now surpassed the life expectancy of the United States? Are we saying that all this is the result of capitalism? Are we saying that capitalism can end poverty? Are we saying that capitalism provides a viable foundation for tackling the climate crisis or the housing crisis? Are we saying that capitalism can develop itself in the way that China has without resource to imperialism and domination and hegemony? Because if that's what we're saying, then frankly, we should stop calling ourselves Marxists. We should stop calling ourselves leftists. We should burn our copies of Capital, and we should just ride the neoliberal wave. So, what I'm trying to put forward is that, yes, China's a socialist country, and China's successors are successors of socialism, and that the global left should take strength from those successors and inspiration from those successors. Sure, there's a great deal of inequality in China. There's private capital, there are billionaires, there are branches of McDonald's and KFC and so on. In many ways, it probably doesn't look like the socialism many of us are imagining. But nonetheless, power is consolidated in the working classes. The country is governed primarily in the interests of the ordinary people. The ruling party is a communist party that takes Marxism extremely seriously. So anyway, there's a lot more to say there, but that's another motivation for me in writing this book, to say to people on the left, here in the West, let's understand China, let's uphold China and celebrate China as the largest and the most advanced socialist country, and globally that's putting forward a vision of peace, cooperation, and common prosperity, which is an alternative vision to the mainstream that's coming from the West, that's coming from the imperialist countries, and is desperately needed. So that's why I've written the book. And, I think we've got a responsibility to learn more about China, build solidarity with China, and very importantly, reject war and reject imperialist aggression against China.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly in that, Carlos. And the political and ideological grounding of your new book on China is important. The fact that you're writing this as a Marxist-Leninist openly, and also out of an attempt to contribute to the global socialist movement, to the anti-imperialist movement, and also doing it in the interest of peace, I think is important, particularly given our current context. And you actually touched on some of my next question, because one of the big questions that I think we hear really across the political spectrum, and I've even had people in my own life ask me about this, is how is it that we can describe China as a socialist country? How is it that we can describe China's economy as a socialist one, given some of the things that you've laid out, Carlos, when we talk about the inequality in the country, the fact that there are billionaires in the country, stock markets, and things like this, people point to this and say that this evidence is that China is not socialist and that it's really a capitalist country sort of masquerading as a socialist one and hasn't really been a socialist country since the end of the Mao era. And so how are we to understand China as a socialist country in the 21st century? And I think this is really important, particularly for those of us who are Marxists, and I myself am a Marxist-Leninist as well, because I feel that oftentimes in the U.S. and the West, our conception of socialism, both that which, currently exists and how it's been carried through in the past, I think oftentimes we can get caught up in an idealism. It's almost like a fantasy that a lot of us have about what socialism is supposed to look like. And when we consider China, I feel like there's a number of factors and a lot of context that skews how we see the countries itself, not the least of which the lies and propaganda from the imperialists that you noted earlier. And so just to restate, how is it that we can rightly call China a socialist state, given how it operates, Carlos?
Right. Yeah. I mean, a very important question. And in many ways, that's kind of, if there's any one single question that my book tries to explore, it's kind of that, and that's there in the title, right? The East is still red. And I'm making a very clear statement that not only was the East red between 1949 and 1976, when Mao Zedong died, the East is still red. So as you'll know, and as many of your listeners will know, starting in the late 1970s, starting in 1978 or so, China introduced a set of market reforms. It's entered into a period of what it calls reform and opening up. And one result of that is that there are, these days, vast quantities of private capital in China. As you've said, there are stock markets, there are billionaires. There are major Western brands like Starbucks and McDonald's. There are big businesses. There's huge inequality. There's integration into global value chains. And as you've said, a lot of people look at this and say, well, this doesn't feel very socialist. I think, my starting point is that there are some other aspects of China that need to be considered as well that make it really quite a lot different to, just another average capitalist country. For one thing, like pretty much everyone lives a lot better than they used to. In capitalist countries, the rich get richer, but the poor typically get poorer at the same time. Sometimes that's distorted a little bit because sometimes that counterpoint of poverty takes place in different countries, like the counterpoint of first world wealth or imperialist world wealth is third world or global south poverty. But nonetheless, that's the dynamic, is that the rich get richer and the poor tend to get poorer. But in China, the standard of living for workers and peasants has improved beyond recognition since 1978, when this reform process started. There's no country in the world that has achieved what China has in reducing poverty, in terms of making sure literally everyone has food, housing, clothing, healthcare, clean water, electricity, making sure every child gets at least 10 years of education. India, for example, is another massive Asian country with a population of around 1.4 billion that got its independence at around the same time as China got its liberation. If one compares capitalist India with socialist China, you see that Chinese people are doing really quite a lot better. The life expectancy in China is more than a decade higher than it is in India. The literacy rate in China is practically 100% as compared to India's 75%. China no longer deals with systemic malnutrition. Its per capita GDP is 5 times higher than that of India. And even the poor in China have guaranteed housing, healthcare, education, and so on, which in Asian and kind of global South terms makes them kind of practically middle income. So, we have to find a way of explaining this difference between a huge Asian capitalist country and a huge Asian, is it socialist, is it capitalist, we don't know what it is country, right? And one can also look at the major priorities of the Chinese government, which are very clear in terms of its not just its words but its deeds. What's it really focusing on? It's poverty alleviation, it's tackling climate change, improving living standards, dealing with the pandemic in a way that saves as many lives as possible, cracking down on corruption, improving the education system, improving the healthcare system, ending homelessness, like ensuring dignified care for older people and so on. Not to mention defending China's unity, defending China's territorial integrity, its national pride. All of these very closely match the priorities of ordinary Chinese people. And wouldn't you love to be able to say that about the US, that the government was pursuing the same priorities that ordinary working class people have? That the US or Britain was really prioritizing ending homelessness, or preventing climate breakdown, or developing renewable energy systems, or improving people's quality of lives. Our governments would, in this ideal world, divert resources to improving our education systems and fixing crumbling education systems, instead of fighting a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine and providing the most sophisticated merchandise of death and destruction to a military force which is literally led to a significant degree by neo-Nazis. China's not involved in that sort of project. China's growth model isn't predicated on the military-industrial complex. China's not engaged in an expansionist campaign. So how are we to understand that kind of disparity in priorities? How can we explain the fact that China's government predominantly works in the interests of the Chinese people, while Western governments work predominantly in the interests of a tiny elite? And there's, you can cut it and shape it whatever way you want, but there's really no explanation left other than that China operates according to a fundamentally different political system, i.e. that it's a socialist country. It's a state whose actions are defined primarily on the basis of the interests of the working class and the peasantry. A state that derives its legitimacy from ordinary working people, not that small group of people that own and deploy capital. And there's a quote that I often like to repeat from Shanghai. He's an investor actually, called Eric Lee, and he's interviewed in John Pilger's documentary, The Coming War on China. And he says, yeah, sure, China's a market economy and there are billionaires, but those billionaires don't tell the government or the Politburo what to do, right? Billionaires have to accept the authority of the government. They have to accept that their existence is tolerated to the extent that their activities are contributing to the development of China and are consistent with an overall plan of advance towards common prosperity. He says that's the difference between capitalism and socialism. That's the difference between the US and China. Essentially, China, the government tells the billionaires what to do, as opposed to the US, where billionaires tell the government what to do, right? That's just a profoundly different system to the capitalist countries, which are, they call themselves capitalist democracies. They're a lot more capitalist than they are democratic. Even, the famous economist Joseph Stiglitz has said the US is a country of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. Like whatever party the US electors choose, the government they end up with is capitalist, is imperialist, is responsible primarily to a group of extremely wealthy people who own and deploy capital. Therein the fundamental political difference between China and the West. Therein the fundamental political difference between socialism and capitalism. In terms of I'll just quote something from Xi Jinping, because it's a interesting expression that he says in terms of the basic orientation of the state towards working people. And the quote is, "The working class is China's leading class. It represents China's advanced productive forces and relations of production. It is our party's most steadfast and reliable class foundation, and it's the main force for realizing a moderately prosperous society in all respects." And kind of connected to that, in China, you've got Marxists at the core of society, at the core of government. Everyone studies Marxism, like Marxist worldview, historical materialism, with Chinese characteristics, of course, is the default worldview. Like there are certainly other worldviews. People might be surprised to know that China is actually a very pluralistic society and people hold all sorts of opinions. But Marxism is like the default. Literally millions of people in China every year read the Communist Manifesto, read Capital, read Mao Zedong's writings. The Communist Party has nearly 100 million members, all of whom have taken the admission oath, which is to fight for communism throughout my life, be ready at all times to sacrifice my all for the party and the people. So this thing of only socialism can save China, that's always been the slogan, and that's taken very seriously. And it's kind of the idea that this verbal commitment to Marxism is kind of a scam, a ruse, and it's just designed to bamboozle the Chinese people. It seems like a pretty nutty idea, like that's a serious conspiracy, and that they've maintained for more than 40 years and invoked the services of literally millions of people to play along with it. To me, it's a lot more reasonable to assume that the CPC is indeed committed to socialism and to forging a trajectory towards a communist future. And I think probably it's reasonable to give Fidel Castro the last word on this question of whether China's socialist, because Fidel was someone who knew a certain amount about these things. Fidel said, and I think he was talking in the early 90s on a visit to Beijing, once China was a country of hunger, poverty and disasters. Today there's none of that. Today China feeds, clothes, cares for and educates 1.2 billion people. I think China is a socialist country and Vietnam is a socialist country as well. And he goes on to say that, China's reforms have been about stimulating development and continuing the advance towards socialism. And he says, there's no type of pure socialism. You've got purists, you've got Marxist purists who think there's only one type of socialism, and that it can never involve markets, it can never involve private capital, private property or whatever. He says in Cuba, we've got many forms of private property. We've got tens of thousands of landowners who own, in some cases up to 45 hectares. Practically all Cubans, own their own homes. And what's more, we're more than open to foreign investment. But none of this detracts from Cuba's socialist character. So, in my view, if the definition of China as socialist is good enough for Fidel Castro, it's good enough for the rest of us.